Hi, welcome to another episode of What is Metamodern Conversations. I'm Greg Dember, and my co-host, as always, is Linda Ciriello. And we're excited today to have as our guest, Tim Vermeulen.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So let me do a quick introduction. Timotheus Vermeulen is a scholar and critic from the Netherlands. He's a professor of media, culture, and society at the University of Oslo in Norway, where he teaches and writes on critical and cultural theory, film, and television studies and aesthetics. He's the co-founder of the webzine Notes on Metamodernism. His many publications on metamodernism include, with Robin van den Akker, the 2010 seminal essay in the Journal of Aesthetics and Culture, Notes on Metamodernism, which has been reprinted, translated, and referenced widely. And in 2019, in the European Journal of English Studies, Reality Beckons, Metamodernist Depthiness Beyond Panfictionality, also with Alison Gibbons and Robin van den Akker, and the volume co-edited with Gibbons and van den Akker, Metamodernism, Historicity, Affect, and Depth, published in 2017, which has also been translated into a couple different languages. And this just scratches the surface of your works over the last decade plus. And so we'll put a link to your website for those who would like to see a full list of your articles and book chapters and your full-length texts, and those in progress as well. So we discovered your work in about 2012, and we were really excited to see that someone had applied a term to this thing that we'd also, Greg and I, had been thinking about a lot. In fact, it seems like our initial pathways into metamodernism had some similarities, that each of us was seeking a means of accounting for the cultural artifacts that were appearing to obey different sensibilities than we'd encountered before. So searching in some way for a new aesthetic sensibility or words for this aesthetic sensibility or cultural logic that we felt had to be some kind of a postmodern. Does that sound about right?
That does sound about right. And yeah, because I was actually quite curious how the two of you gotten into the discourse, sort of your pathway there. So this is beginning, I think, to illuminate some of that, and hopefully we can talk about that a bit more later on.
Okay.
I'm quite keen to see where the two of you are coming from here.
Yeah, we're really excited for this conversation for that reason. I feel like we're, coming from different disciplines and different continents and different backgrounds in terms of the types of cultural products that we encounter on a daily basis. And in fact, early on, this is kind of our first topic, I guess. In your 2010 Notes on Metamodernism article, it seemed like you and Robin talked about first noticing these shifts in visual art as part of what got you thinking about postmodernism. And then other people had been looking at literature and metamodern narratives in written works. And then later comes more of the work on film and television and music and other forms of popular culture, which definitely for Greg and myself, there was sort of that other forms of popular culture is one way that we first got into the question of what this was, what we were seeing. So we thought it would be fun to start if we could bring something concrete of metamodern visual art or architecture and talk about it as an artifact that actually Greg and I don't particularly know too well, that you're bringing to us, and then we'll proceed to have our conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, I think, because it's quite perceptive and also quite interesting that Robin is a philosopher and I have a background in philosophy, but I would call myself, I guess, a media scholar first and foremost these days, maybe cultural theorist / media scholar, but that indeed our initial observations were concerned primarily with visual arts. And by that, I mean gallery arts, museum arts. So stuff that we were seeing in the shows that we were visiting, and also the talks and debates around those shows. So this was very much linked to an art form that was of interest to us, but wasn't necessarily our main area of expertise at all. Perhaps this also made it more exciting. I think there is, however, another reason for that hierarchy or the temporal organization where the arts came first, which is that a painting is quite easy to make and quite cheap to make, whereas a book might take longer, a film costs shit tons of money, a TV show even more, and then also has all kinds of pilot audiences that will tell executives whether the TV show works or not. And architecture, of course, especially, is this very sluggish, this very slow artistic form, this applied artistic form, because it needs money, but it also needs space, and it needs all kinds of bureaucratic processes to work. So I think architecture is always latest. So I think there is also a particular reason for that, that distinct organization of when stuff perhaps comes out or is obvious or is easily discernible. As for architecture, because this is what you asked for, I mean, I was in Venice a while back to see the biennial, where the main question was, how will we live together? Which I think in and of itself is already a question that is very different from which influences do we use, or what is the most cost effective, etc., etc. Right? There's all kinds of questions we could ask of architects, but how will we live together? And then the emphasis, I guess, both on the we and the together, seems to me in itself to be a question quite pertinent to the metamodern moment, where we ask for ways in which we, regardless of where we're from or how we feel or what we associate with, can find ways, can build, can use spaces to come together somehow, right? And this we then includes not just humans, but also, this was very present at the biennial, which I, by the way, didn't think was a success, but in any case, was very present there, also other species, right? So also the non-human or the post-human and so on and so forth. And I think this was quite interesting, that there is this question pertaining to a future, to a moment that is not of the here and the now. And if I think back of the modernist architecture, which we think about brutalism, we think about minimalism, we think about less is more, right? We think about structures that are purely there for the functionality of the living, right? In the first case, of course, the whole aesthetic that comes with it, you could say this or that about, but the instance is about functionalism. It's about, this is what you need to live. And then postmodernism does the opposite. It begins to sort of, you know, begins to look like Las Vegas. It takes everything apart and puts it together, and you get all those weird fake simulacral palaces and eclectic forms. And it's very much about all kinds of formalism, all kinds of flourishes and things like that. So it's a sort of a playful architecture. So you have a very functional architecture, brutalism I think comes to mind here most, and you've got a very playful architecture. And then I would say the architecture that we've seen occurring for the last 20 years or so, not all together maybe, but in fits and stages, is what we in the initial article called either a sort of a green architecture or a romantic architecture, and what we might also call, as Bjarke Ingels, a very important architect in this recent movement, calls hedonistic sustainability, or yes is more, is an architecture that combines, you might say, the functionalism, the attention to detail for how we might build a house that is functional for living in, with those postmodern flourishes, but, and this is important, with two kinds of additions. The first is that it thinks about the environment as a whole, so that the house is more than a house, the skyscraper is more than a skyscraper, the school is more than a school. It has to be part, both aesthetically, but also ecologically, of a wider landscape. It has to function not just for us living in it, but it has to function for everything surrounding it as well, right? And that everything might be the smaller houses outside, but also the larger ecosystem. And second, I think also that this care, this detail for the people living in it is a very different care, perhaps, than the one that we saw with Mies van der Rohe or something, or in the modernist aesthetic of the early 20th century, where the architecture is quite hard. And people, it's not just that it's made functional for people to live in, this is how people are supposed to be living in those places, right? Which is, as a result, we know that quite a few of those projects failed, or people started doing their own stuff with those buildings and reorganizing them entirely. This is especially, of course, with the Corbusier buildings, the case. And that what I think these metamodern architects is that they put their ear to the ground a bit more. So there is more care also for the individual intimate needs of people. So it isn't more saying you have to live like this. It is more inviting a discussion, a debate. How do you think you should live, right? Which brings me back to the Venice Biennial. How should we live together is posed as a question. And I think that's quite important here in this system. How should we live together? Not one of us will probably have the answer, or actually probably definitely not one of us will have the answer, but us together might come to some sort of answer to that question. And so I think that's why the biennial, for all its problems, did pose a very important question, and I think a very pertinent question to our moment. And so if I take an example, Bjarke Ingels, power station / ski slope in Copenhagen, that works in such a way, right? It fulfills a particular need, which is that it's a power station, or I think it burns garbage or something like that. But that energy is used then to also allow for people to ski down, to create a skiing environment. So it uses the energy that it has to take in order to do something else. And so it offsets each other. And so that becomes part in multiple ways of that environment, both in fulfilling a need for the city's energy or garbage or whatever, and it fulfills a need for the pleasures of the people in that town. So I think, I'm not sure if I'm very articulate about this, but this is what I would say at this stage. Does it make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I now I'm understanding the usage of the term hedonistic sustainability, which I was instantly, attracted to, wondering what does that exactly mean. And I could envision it pretty well with your example of the ski resort, but also what you said prior to that, taking hedonistic just to mean simply not how should we live, but how do we want to live? What choices and options and very personal, involvement can we have?
I don't know if it will work. I don't know if this is a sustainable system. But in any case, this point is, with hedonistic sustainability, but also with this sort of broader slogan, a very catchy one of "Yes is more," is that indeed we should be able to live however we want. However, we should not take advantage in that process of the ecosystem. We should make sure that the way we live helps out or supports that ecosystem. So it's not that we should change our behavior, it's that we should change the way in which that behavior impacts or relates to the environment around it.
Nice,
From seeing some of his work, it looks like a lot of it is very visually playful. And it seems kind of from the framework that you brought up in terms of the modernist architecture and the postmodern architecture, that playfulness maybe is inherited from the postmodern, but also you were talking about the metamodern architecture taking care of not just the human functional needs, but also the emotional needs. And I think that playfulness is partly fulfilling an emotional need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this, I think Rogan at one point wrote about the change from this eclecticism we associate with postmodernism, which Jameson almost wholly dismisses as mere blank parody, as pastiche, something he's not very fond of, to a fruitful whatever works, right? So you're using stuff because it works together, right? So you are eclectic. The eclecticism isn't over, isn't done, but the eclecticism works precisely to create something new together. So it isn't about the individual backgrounds of each of those pieces on those buildings, individual histories that it might have. It is about the effective register or the usefulness that they create. I mean, if we want, I guess we could go to Community, which is a show that I think does exactly the same thing, right? Community is entirely eclectic, but I think it would be absolute nonsense to call that eclecticism empty in any way or form. I think it's precisely this eclecticism, this generic jumbling and mixing of all kinds of registers, that allows for an alternative space or no space to emerge within which meaning is made, right? If there's a drawing on a mafia film, or if there's a drawing on a sitcom convention, it's used to deepen the effective possibilities of that moment, rather than to just signpost something else. So this notion of whatever works, it's an eclecticism geared towards a particular moment of the future. I'm also thinking now of, I think we mentioned this artist in our first article, David Thorpe, or closer to home, the Dutch artist Voerman, who are also artists that work in both of their cases, with materials from failed utopias, political ones, but also ones from sci-fi movies. That, you know, all of these utopias we know to have failed. They all turn into dystopias, perhaps from the start. And yet, by sort of reusing them, putting them together in different constellations, they're trying to somehow put some of the energy that was in those projects towards different goals. Right, so it's I mean, I think I've mentioned this before in other talks. It is, I think, part of why originally we thought about the name judo-modernism, in the sense, which wouldn't have been such a successful term, but does capture some of, I think, of the core of what we're talking about here. Is this, you know, in judo, what is so wonderful about judo, and I did judo for a long time when I was younger, is that you only work with one energy. It's not like kickboxing or karate, where you have sort of a conflict all the time, right? Someone beats and the other one is taking it. But judo works with one energy. You hold each other and then you move with the same energy. And so you can only throw someone with that single energy. And so, for example, if Greg or Linda, you would try to throw me, I could take over the energy and put you on the ground, on the floor. But it's the same energy. And for me, this is quite key. There isn't some kind of metaphysical miracle. There isn't a deus ex machina here, right? For example, the climate, we all know this is not going to end well for any of us, right? So it isn't that there's something suddenly that's going to help us. We're working with the energy that's already there. It's just that you redirect it into a different direction. And this, to me, seems quite, quite an accurate description of some of those instances.
Yeah.
I've used the term constructive pastiche.
That's nice.
To identify, I think, what you're talking about. And I distinguish that from, I guess I'd call it dissociative pastiche of postmodernism. And kind of the way I look at it is that with the postmodern dissociative pastiche, the artist brings together disparate elements to kind of undermine each other, or to poke at each other, and each kind of mutually reveals the falsehoods or unexamined assumptions that each brings. Whereas with the constructive pastiche, which I think of as a metamodern method, my visual image is kind of like each of the disparate elements work together like tent poles, leaning against each other to provide a framework that you can drape a canvas over, or whatever, to create that space in which something meaningful can live.
That's really nice. That's really nice, actually, constructive pastiche. It's funny that we're now talking about pastiche. I'm in the process of editing a special issue with a colleague of mine, Kim Wilkins, here about pastiche and postmodernism in visual media. And the attempt is really also to think through pastiche as less of a singular concept, right? Because I think we all associate pastiche with postmodernism, even though we know that there's quite a lot of historians out there that have said, well, pastiche, obviously, you know, it has its grounding on the Baroque, and perhaps even before that in antiquity, but definitely in the Baroque period. And so there's loads of different types of pastiche that we rarely discuss. And so I think perhaps one of these, and that's why this sounds really good, constructive pastiche, because I'm guessing there's quite a number of different types of pastiche. I don't know if, for example, the pastiche that community uses is the same as the pastiche that someone like Voerman would use, or that someone like Coco Rosie would, right? They might be, but I'm not sure. Maybe we should really, maybe this is one of the things that I think, hopefully, we will all together as a sort of a scholarly community figure out, is that we use these observations vis-a-vis metamodernism as a starting point to begin thinking through some of those critical concepts. And I think pastiche, for example, is one that definitely needs a rethink, right? Because Jameson, I mean, I love Jameson, but he turns pastiche into a very, very narrow concept, right? That I've been using. But of course, pastiche is much bigger than what Jameson says it to be. I mean, Linda Hudson, for one, criticizes that and makes pastiche into a far bigger thing. So it's, I think, I like this constructive pastiche. Maybe there's more.
So if I'm trying to distinguish between this is a postmodern product and this is not, it's something else. What is that something else about it? And so if I was taking a look at a television show and whether it was giving me a feeling of sort of that the ironic, the usage of irony was sort of heavy on me, and it wasn't giving me a very effervescent feeling of possibility. It was kind of like, okay, what I'm meant to do here is tear down. And the term that I have used sometimes is a deconstructive destabilization. So what we're trying to do is tear it down to show that there is no there behind the scenes, behind the curtain in the Wizard of Oz. We've pulled the curtain back. There's only that guy there. It's not real. Whereas in metamodernism, of course, we have the sense that there's an awful lot that may not be real, or it may be complete fabrication, but it still doesn't make it not something of value. So we can say there's a constructive destabilization. Destabilizing is still happening, but for maybe a constructive purpose. So we were talking about the television show Community, and to me, there's always a building back, and they even play with the building back. The narratives will pull them all back together at the end, but there's a kind of a winking, we understand that the story has gone this way because that's the way stories go. And there's a little twist there usually. We've talked about Community in our last two videos in our series here. So it seems to be a theme that maybe we'll be pulling throughout our whole series. I don't know. But
I mean, Community seems particularly, I mean, also because what I like so much about the show is that it understands that that each genre allows for specific things to be said and not said, for specific things to be made visible, for specific things to be felt, right? And so if you begin to mix that or change genre per episode, it really allows for different emotions and different registers to come to the fore. And I think it did that in such mostly successful ways for the first 3 seasons. I don't know, maybe part of the 5th season, I don't know, but right. And I think that was quite exciting. I mean, but you really said something quite interesting there. And I mean, I wrote at one point an article which wasn't a very good article. It wasn't successful. It was at least not what I had hoped it would become. But it started from this premise that so many studies of the postmodern, they start from the shopping mall, right? The shopping mall becomes this microcosm or this emblem of postmodernism because it's a simulation, it's an interiority, it's eclectic, it's all about commodities, it's all about surfaces of the shopping windows, and so on and so forth. And Camille de Toledo, this brilliant French poet, artist, musician, theoretician, wrote this wonderful book in the early 2000s called Coming of Age at the End of History. And it also takes as its starting point the shopping mall. And I also thought that this shopping mall is a very useful metaphor for us to think about the metamodern, not in the least because this metaphor of the shopping mall is now on the scrap heap of history, right? Almost no one today talks about shopping malls anymore, whether it's philosophers, because they talk about viruses, or they talk about topologies, right? There's new metaphors that better encapsulate their projects, but also, of course, because shopping malls in reality are having a really tough time of it. So the shopping mall seems to be this thing that's past now, right? If the arcade was the architecture of the modern, and then the shopping mall is the architecture of the postmodern, now it's no longer there. In any case, it seemed to me that what has happened with this meta-modern moment is also explicable in terms of the shopping mall. So we come at that end of history, and then Tony Blair and Francis Fukuyama, they tell us come into the shopping mall because outside it's all terrorism and shit, and don't go outside. So we go inside, the doors are barricaded, we walk around in these air-conditioned halls, and it's quite marvelous, right? We can shop, we can get coffee from all over the world at the local Starbucks, which is served presumably also by people from all over the world. Right? And so we feel quite at ease. But gradually what happens, for whatever reason, is that people start to feel unwell in that shopping mall, right? Maybe it's the air conditioning that makes us breathe louder. And Camille de Toledo calls this a claustrophobia of the chest, which is, I think, such a wonderful term. So a claustrophobia of the chest, we feel sick, right? I think this is where David Foster Wallace's parable of the patient comes in. So we go to the doctor, and the doctor can't really help us. We go to therapists, they can't really help us. We feel increasingly bad. And then, as we are already not feeling so well, we try to do gym also, right? This is Slavoj Žižek's wonderful metaphor of the person who looks like Schwarzenegger, but also has a pacemaker, right? So we build those empty signifiers of muscle, the graveyard of signifiers, Baudrillard calls this. Nothing helps. And then as we are strolling around, feeling increasingly bad, the mall also takes a turn for the worse, right? I don't know if this is the 2008 crisis or whatever, but something is beginning to go. So the shops are boarded up, right? People are beginning to have less to spend in those shops. And so all in all, this shopping mall begins to look like every shopping mall does when we hit the mid-2000s, a zombie movie, right? We're all walking around in this sort of shopping mall that is increasingly boarded up, where the air conditioning is making us have this claustrophobia of the chest. And we find that there's no way out. Shopping malls don't have any windows. They're not part of the outside because they're simulated environments. And so the idea is really that then we hear something on the walls, right? We hear this stomping sound, and it might be something great. It might be something good. It might be an illusion. It might be something real. It might be that the air conditioning is creating the sound, or it might be some kind of metaphysical thing. It might be that the outside isn't gone after all. There's still something out there, right? We don't know. And yet, in order for us to reorganize this insight, to give meaning once again, people begin to take to those sounds. They begin to paint pictures on the walls, right? Pretending to see what it could look like. They begin to behave different, and so on and so forth. There's a longer story here, right? We could talk about how fast and slow we are supposed to walk. We could talk about all kinds of things. But this is, I think, the gist for me of this metamodern moment. There is this knocking sound that comes at a moment where we already have this claustrophobia of the chest, where we aren't feeling well, where the shops are boarded up. And so this is the way of pertaining to it. So it's a possibility of metaphysics, but not its actualization. It's a possibility of an outside, but we don't really know if it's there. It's a possibility of an ecological disaster, but and so on and so forth. So it's this living in between, which is then what Charles Krauthammer, John Aquila, another conservative critic for, I mean, I don't know how I could ever cite a conservative critic, but there you go, calls the bend of history, right? Something is just around the corner. Who knows what it is? Sorry, I realize this was a long way, but I figured this is, I think, where a lot of those projects, whether it's Bjarke Ingels or Community or David Thorpe, in a way come to the fore, right? These are, it seems to me, each ways to try and deal with those knocking sounds while still staying squarely within the mall. None of us has made it out, right? We're not outside of that. We are still living in this mall. We are still living in this post-modern, or whatever you want to call it, simulation. It's just that we are aware suddenly that something is all right. Something is not there. Something is happening. Yeah, so sorry for that long detour.
No, thank you for the detour. I just want to ask if I'm understanding it, and then I have another question. So would you say that the metamodern response to this shopping mall situation is characterized, or metamodern art, so to speak, is that which does respond to the perceived knockings, even though we don't know exactly what the knockings signify? We act as if they might signify something that means something to us, and then we attempt to communicate with it via painting on the walls, or I mean, I haven't read the piece that you were citing, but painting on the walls or dancing to the sound.
It's not a great success, but yes, I would say yes, it's that, right? It's the painting on the wall of painting here used in the, right? It could be all kinds of art, all kinds.
It could be dancing, or.
But this sense of pertaining to an outside that you have no idea about.
Okay.
Right, this pertaining as if there was something else that we might go to. Right? And for me, that is indeed that response, right? It's a renewed, you might say, affordance or allowance of the possibility that there are futures out there that are other than the ones at hand, right?
Yeah.
That aren't predicted by the algorithms of the mall inside, that cannot be run by any of the companies that are giving us these models for how life will unfold. So it's something else, right? In which context, I think it also makes sense that we see a return both of all kinds of mysticism, but also of all kinds of religion within this system of the mall, because there is this knocking, right? Who knows what it is? I mean, I think I probably know what it is. It's the end of the world saying, here I am, see you later, guys. But in any case, I think this would be that response, right? It's this pertaining to without really knocking through the walls. Right?
There's something about the way that you've portrayed the fact that, yes, the shopping mall certainly, especially the abandoned shopping mall, gives us this sense of realities that were portended, but they're possibilities that there's like a potential that just sits and can't find its fruition necessarily, because it's over constructed, it's over determined. And so we're walking around in there trying to step into these worlds that were created for us to look like this and walk like this and be like this, if I get what you're saying. And the other thing that I liked about, at least where my mind went when you were talking about being on the inside of this space and drawing on the walls or painting on the walls, it makes me think of like a childlike impulse to just sort of get in an imaginal space and do something almost irreverent or naughty, to draw on the walls, to change the environment. I'm a child with crayons, and this is just a canvas. It's not like a special wall of a house that needs to be clean. It's a canvas. And so there are ways that I think we can certainly track some of what I think we would agree are metamodern aesthetic impulses. And one of them is that a bit of childlike or refiguring in a childlike way what this is supposed to be or what that should be.
Yeah, I think that's very good. I think it is childlike, but I would say with the knowledge, that, I mean, I can only speak now for myself, and I'm guessing the two of you, we aren't blank canvases ourselves, right? So yes, I would say we have that childlike naivety, but it is coupled to a knowledge that we don't actually know what this outside looks like, right? I think the moment that we forget that, or we are indifferent to it, and we're in all kinds of shit. I mean, I'm also thinking here, I mean, that's really good, Linda, because there's this Dutch children's book called Ortje. It's an old children's book of a daughter who lives with her father, who's a chef in a hotel restaurant, and an alcoholic. I mean, this is a Dutch children's book, so big problems come up immediately. And the father is working there, and because he's an alcoholic, they have no money to live somewhere. And so there is a grotto in the hotel lobby, one of those, that we sometimes see in big hotels, this grotto with a little waterfall cave, some fake trees around it. And she and the father, they live in this little grotto, invisible to anyone outside of it, just with some mice. And so it's what I like so much is that it shows that space is never singular, right? The shopping mall, indeed, it completely pre-models space for us. This is what Baudrillard means when he talks about simulation, right? It's the model that precedes reality. It's the model that already says to us, this is how you're supposed to walk. This is what you're supposed to do here, right? So it pre-organizes everything and preempts it as a result. But what Ortje shows is that even in this hotel lobby, a non-place, if there ever was one, right? A place with no heart, with no soul, there you can create for yourself within the plastic, you can create this bubble, if you will. I mean, Henri Lefebvre, who's been a really great influence on Robin and myself. I mean, both of us wrote chunks of our PhD on Henri Lefebvre, but he was also one of the great influences for Frederick Jameson. He was the teacher for Jean Baudrillard. He writes about space not as a given or not as something that's there. He says that space is always a trialectic. I don't know if you're familiar with Lefebvre, but he always says that space is a trialectic concept. So it's three forces that are always there in one time, right? So there's the force, he says, of let's call it the bureaucrats and the government officials and the banks, right, that are having, he calls this conceived space. They have a particular plan for the space, right? This is not necessarily bad, right? This could also be the crossing on a road that allows us all to walk safely to the other side. So the conceived space. Then there is such a thing as the lived space, which is the space as we actually enact it, as we perform it. So if we see that crossing, we will go over that crossing and not, go somewhere else where it's more dangerous to cross the road. And then there's something that he calls perceived space. And this is the space of our dreams, of our imaginations. So for example, have we kissed someone at one point on this crossing? This will linger for us. And perhaps even all the other crossings. Once we've kissed someone on a crossing, every crossing we encounter will have this part of our perceived space with us. And he says that in a healthy society, these three always work together. But according to Lefebvre, what happens with capitalism and urbanization in the late 20th century is that this triad becomes a pyramid, a hierarchy, where conceived space begins to dominate the others, right? This is where you get the matrix, or indeed where Baudrillard gets this notion of simulation from, right? Where conceived space determines what you can experience, what you can feel there, and it determines exclusively how you behave there. And I think what the shopping mall is that, right? It's this hierarchy, because the shopping mall knows really well, the architects organize really well that we have to walk here like this, and then we find a McDonald's just at the moment that we're hungry, right? Or then we find at Starbucks just at the moment that we might be in need of a coffee. Or, oh, there's the swimming store, so we can, and so on and so forth, right? So these are all these algorithms that model our behavior. But that doesn't mean that space always has to be like that, right? And I think, Linda, what you say is so great, because it's exactly that, right? A child doesn't know that. A child perceives that space in a completely different way. And so a child might draw on the walls, or teenagers that just hang in the mall, right? Also not fulfilling its purpose, right? They, in a way, they come with completely different perceptive schemas. And so they are also perhaps what allows the mall to change then. Yeah, sorry.
Greg, were you going to ask another question?
Yeah, it seems that there's pretty good agreement that the shift from postmodernism to metamodernism happened somewhere around the year 2000. But we may have different views on what actually caused the shift, or maybe we don't have different views. But for me, the main thing that draws my attention is the actual I see the shift from modernism to postmodernism, and the shift from postmodernism to metamodernism all being pushed by artists and their audiences becoming exhausted with the current prevalent sensibility or episteme. So I would say, as at the end of the postmodern period, what was originally kind of an enlivening awareness of context, of the importance of context, and the importance of unacknowledged points of view, and things like that, and the sort of playful play with referentiality and things like that, that kind of that ran its course for people, because it was leaving out interiority and the sense of the self and the sense of meaning. It was all kind of being drained away, or it felt like that. And so then, to me, the shift to metamodernism is people wanting to do something different and bring back a sense of meaning or purpose, or interiority, while still being aware of the postmodern dimensions. So that's the main driver that I see, but it seems like, Tim, that in your and Robin's work, and Allison's too, you do spend more time talking about changes in the actual economic and technological landscape as the drivers that sort of demand a new sensibility. And Linda, I think that you also bring in the effect that the interplay between Eastern spiritualities and Western spirituality kind of have an influence on this whole move. So yeah, I'm just curious how you both see the relative importance of these factors.
You want to go first, Linda?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I guess I feel like I kind of walk a middle ground between the social and economic factors that it's pretty hard to argue that those don't drive artists in some ways to respond. And then also the aesthetic pull of the waning of an epistemic, sensibility that, like Greg already explained, sort of feels like it's played itself out for reasons that may also have to do, back again, with social realities. But the other factor that Greg was alluding to for me is this, because what I was trying to do, to back up a bit, is in my work I was setting out to ask, like, why this metamodernism, or why this postmodernism, and why now? So we all notice a shift is happening, and trends and sensibilities react to social conditions, yes, but why did it end up looking like this? So for me, my focuses in Asian religions as they have come to the West is one of my subfields. And so I found it hard not to track some of the aesthetics that we were seeing. Earnestness, sincerity, coupled with this awareness of the always already reflexive, ironic, multiplex view of our identities. Currently, we can chalk a lot of that up to social media, at least partly, showing how social media is a means of living out many identities, and that has these repercussions on us existentially, I think. Other conversation branch. But the truth is, these concepts about how we now live through many identities have this many thousands of year old history in Vedanta and Buddhism that came to the West only relatively recently, but made an undeniable headway in the Western imaginary. So this is part of my sort of historiographic work of looking at late 19th century, and then really taking off as practices and schools that spread these certain tenets and concepts very widely, to fast forward to the turn of the millennium, where basically inadvertently we're soaking in these ideas. And a few of the concepts I'm talking about would be like these maxims that we have now, like be in the moment, or we're all one, or mindfulness, which is, and I'm talking about appropriations of these from their more originary meanings. It's what the West has brought to these ideas. For example, the emergence of systems theory in the 1990s could be seen as stemming out of the central Buddhist tenet of dependent co-arising, which is just everything emerges and reacts to everything else and affects everything else in turn, which sounds utterly elemental to us now, but that's part of the point, is these concepts coming to us are coming by osmosis to us now. I mean, we're soaking in them, like I said, like mindfulness. We have this word for a whole bunch of practices now that it's basically, it's a widely detraditionalized version of 2,500-year-old philosophy. It's actually in effect training us and increasing our self-reflexive awareness in some ways. It's increasing the very language and practices of cultivating reflexivity. So sometimes Greg and I talk about metamodernism as being characterized by, and maybe even the hub of it, the heart of it, being hyper self-reflexivity. So what you do in a mindfulness practice is, you reflect on yourself, and then you reflect on the subject-object split that's necessary to reflect on yourself, until later in more advanced practices, you dissolve that subject-object split if you're, well practiced. And maybe you have a non-dual realization, or something that a lot of spiritual seekers are really hoping that will be part of their reality in one day. So whether or not we're actually recognizing that we're doing a mindfulness practice for that, or just to have a better time dealing with your in-laws or something, the concept becomes more culturally normative. And so anyway, the point, what's significant to metamodern sensibilities, is that the metamodern turn looks the way it does, in part, I say, because of this preponderance of people absorbing what became generalized ideas, universalisms. And then with the secularization effect of postmodernism, a lot of spiritual talk went underground with this kind of taboo against adhering to truth claims. So then the New Age moniker goes out of fashion, and then becomes a spiritual but not religious later in the 2000s, which is not the same as the 1970s New Age, because it was mixed with and imbued with this reflexive and ironic gaze of situatedness in culture. So we couldn't have 100% universal truth claims anymore for a lot of people. We've seen behind the curtain, but we still have seeking. We have spiritual seeking, or if you like, we have secular meaning seeking. And so that's something I look at in my work, is what caused that shift towards something that both seeks these truths and understands truths as relative and contingent. And so your often quoted passage from you and Robin's, I think it was your initial essay about the desire for sense and the skepticism about the sense of it all, that just jumped right out at me as writing this liminal middle space, which is, to me, kind of the domain of the study of mystical experience, religious experience, and what I sometimes call the big aha. Any moment of realization comes from parting these two, splitting the binary. So I don't want to say there's a one-way causative vector at all. I really want to say that the construction of new epistemic sensibilities comes as a reaction to conditions, but also is made and shaping those conditions, including this idea, again, returning to that aesthetic yearnings maybe they crop up on their own, but in a soup, if that made sense.
I mean, that's brilliant. That was actually that was an aha moment for me.
I just condensed my dissertation for you.
No, this was really wonderful, because in response to both of you, I think what for Robin and myself, and also for Alison, it also wasn't one or the other, right? I mean, of course, Robin's a Marxist, and so yes, the material conditions are important, but at the same time, that's why we chose Raymond Williams as one of our key figures, right? Material conditions don't explain everything all the time, right? And so from the get-go, we've said there's these three reasons, right? There is this there's these crises: political, ecological, financial, all these various senses of, the world's always in crisis, but these particular kind of crises that give us a sense of necessity for change. Parallel to this, or I don't know, before or after, there's these means by which we can affect those changes, right? The new media, social media. I think many of those changes are turning out to be for the worse, but there you go. But then also, I agree entirely with Greg, there's also a new generation. There's just a group of people who started. Foster Wallace, when he starts writing those essays, nothing really has changed, right? He writes that stuff in the 90s, the heydays of, I would say, American postmodernism. He doesn't do that because there is any dissatisfaction with ecological issues, or he isn't thinking about the economy. He's just bored. He just feels that this is a dead end. We need to do something else. So I think all of those run parallel. And I would actually say, now that you mentioned this, Linda, that probably yours is this sort of fourth context, right? Which is indeed a particular kind of, Bourriot in his Ultramodernism exhibition called this also, a kind of a Creolism, right? It's also, there's a mixture of particular kinds of influences and spheres where we aren't so interested in where each comes from, but in what they sort of mix and bring together. So that might be similar, but I really would agree with you that I think this is very important. It's this renewed building on different global cultural contexts. And of course, Nietzsche, right? This is in philosophy, this is always, right? Nietzsche is completely inspired, of course, famously by Buddhism. I think we should really do it like this, because he makes it his own in very particular ways. But right, there is this tradition, Derrida famously, right? So there is a tradition in philosophy where the Eastern influences are there. We don't even have to go now to sort of psychoanalysis, and there's a far bigger reach still. But there's always been this. But I really think it's a very convincing story that you tell about these influences, the secularization on the one hand, and on the other hand, this merging, this influx of different kinds of models of finding meaning, I guess, that coalesce, because it is important that all of those things you mentioned, all of those mysticisms or religions, mindfulness is completely decontextualized, of course, right? So it has the decontextualizedness of the postmodern. By decontextualized, I mean outside of its original context, but I also mean outside of any institutional context, right? Outside of any communal context, right? It's in the first place, it's an individual thing, right? It works really well with capital. You can do that shit at home, right? And you don't have to bother anyone with it. You can just be mindful on your own, and then you can keep working, right? I mean, this is the most cynical view, right, that I'm giving now. So I also think that it is interesting that this return comes at a moment that everything is deinstitutionalized and people are finding their own ways to it. That doesn't mean that they're limited by capital. It doesn't mean that those ways at all cannot, overcome it or go elsewhere and provide us with proper meaningful moments. But at the moment, they also do seem to come naturally to a particular system. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but no, that was brilliant. I'm completely in agreement with you. I could never articulate it as well, but that sounds completely convincing to me.
Yeah, and certainly, of course, I'm looking through my lenses, which are focused on Asian philosophic and religious traditions. We have to look at other global, influences to be sure that I don't know very much about.
Sorry, I keep saying this is good, but I mean it. I think this is really brilliant because what we see in the arts and architecture and perhaps also in philosophy is also a return to a variety of indigenous models of meaning making and indigenous models of living together, right? So it is indeed, it's Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion, but it's also definitely indigenous models of being together, right? This was very present at the biennial. And so I think you're right, it is, right? We see this globalization works in these ways as well, I guess, yeah.
Some people might argue that metamodernism has actually undergone changes in its trajectory, in its characteristics since the early 2000s. 2010s to now, but it also could vary with respect to regions. I've just begun to speculate on this myself because living in the Seattle area, for example, we maybe saw certain kinds of instantiations of metamodern cultural products or characteristics maybe run their course a little bit, whereas
having arisen earlier.
Having arisen early and really been done, like let's take the quirky, for example. There might even have been a sense at some point that cultural expressions of the quirky were becoming almost too prevalent in film and TV. We're seeing too much of it. So people burning out on a certain aesthetic. Whereas in another area of the country, the United States being so large, I spend a lot of time in North Carolina, for example, and I would see that the sensibilities might have been on a wave or a continuum that crashed at a different time. Maybe hasn't burned out so much yet. Don't quote me on that particular example, but so we've got the given locale, and then we've also got this sense of the timing.
No, that seems to me that seems really relevant and a very interesting question. I also would agree. I mean, personally, I think many of us can agree we're a bit done with the quirky, right? Because it became overly prevalent in a way. There's two answers to that. The first is Jameson's answer, which is that postmodernism and the postmodern sensibilities that he describes as the senses of an end have a variety of aesthetic registers, right? So although quirky is indeed, I also agree, on its way out, or indeed we might say that very distinct sort of childlike sensitivity of Coco Rosie is on its way out. Similar sensibilities working through very different registers are on their way up. So I don't think necessarily that the sensibilities are gone, but I do think the registers are changing. That's the first answer. The second is that I do agree with you that I think some of these sensibilities might disappear. And that's not just regional. I also think this is to do with class, which is something people rarely want to talk about, but to me seems to be one of the key issues generally of our moment. But also, I mean, metamodernism, when Robin and I started talking about it, was very, very much an upper middle class, higher educated thing, right? We can say it wasn't, but definitely it was, in the same way that quality television, The Wire or Mad Men or I May Destroy You, this is all made for us. Right, this is all made for the higher educated, often metropolitan or cosmopolitan people who've traveled, who hang out in particular bars, who have backgrounds like the three of us, right? And so I do think that there are different timelines, perhaps also depending not just on regions, but also depending on which socioeconomic class you belong to, what your aesthetic tastes as a result of that partly are, right? I'm guessing the reality TV, for example, it took a bit longer for some of those metamodern sensibilities to go into that than it took for quality television fiction. And I'm guessing the same goes for music. I don't know anything about country, But I know that country has made a meta-modern turn. I've heard this much, but I don't think it did it as fast as some of the New York-based scene, right?
Correct.
Or perhaps indeed the Seattle-based scene. So I do think it's also, it's a good question, but I think regions is too small. I think we also have different timelines depending on the class and the education and so on and so forth.
And possibly some darker timelines to reference
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's nice.
I wanted to push back on something that the two of you both seem to agree on, or I want to nuance it. I don't think that the quirky has gone out. I think that, and I'm looking at Billie Eilish as my example, the young singer who's taking over the world. So what I see in her work is kind of a meta oscillation, and it really is an oscillation. She switches between one and then the other. She will be very childlike and have ukuleles and glockenspiels and sing in a kind of girly childlike voice at one moment, and then on the flip of a dime, even within the same song, she'll shift to a very hardcore transgressive sexual persona. And these aesthetic registers, I think, in the past would have been anathema to each other. Like the people who liked one would not have been interested in the other, or would have been offended by the other, but she brings them together. And again, it's kind of a constructive pastiche where she's bringing them together to express something that could not be expressible in either one alone. And when she's doing the quirky side, I think she even has a self-awareness that some people might think that the quirky is played out, and yet she's insisting on keeping it in her mix.
It could be argued, because I agree with everything you said about Billie Eilish, except I'm wondering, I mean, I agree, it's definitely metamodern. I think those oscillations are definitely present, but is it quirky? Is it quirky in the same way that some of those projects that we would imagine to be quirky, for example, the stuff that Jim writes about Wes Anderson films or Miranda July, is it quirky in those ways, or do these oscillations play out in an aesthetic register which is different? I mean, you know, speaking of Seattle, I always imagined that Billie Eilish, and if I look at many of my students now, this is sort of this post-grunge kind of, this grunge infused with the kind of childlike naivety, right? Which I'm guessing, I mean, grunge is a very different aesthetic register from a Wes Anderson movie. Well, and yet I agree with you entirely that I think Billie Eilish also, I mean, you know, there's loads of stuff being held in check there, but I'm wondering, is it quirky?
Yeah, I think that she presence is quirky at times, and when she does, she fully inhabits it. She's not being sarcastic about it.
Yeah, like for example, there was a prominent photo shoot a few years ago now, but she's sitting on a rainbow rug in a child's bedroom, which is actually her bedroom, and she's playing with her Invisalign, you know, and just absolutely inhabiting that I am a kid. This is how a kid lives. I am a kid. Completely unapologetically.
I always just, if I think of quirky, I'm sort of thinking of a mixture between, you know, the smart film, let's say, or you know, maybe new wave, and the childlike naivety of drawing on the wall. If I think of Billie Eilish, I'm thinking of Nirvana meets Lady Gaga meets a child drawing on the wall. So this is maybe, but you might be right? But this is where I think for me it's definitely metamodern. But why I would have never imagined it to be quirky, but instead thought it's something that, I don't know, probably someone has found a name for. But you might be right, Greg and Linda, that, I mean, this sounds very quirky, the picture you just sketch.
Well, I don't know how much of Billie Eilish you've listened to or seen. So I may be underestimating, you know, what your exposure is. So I apologize.
Never underestimate me.
Okay.
No, overestimating probably.
But you know, it's possible that you're actually missing a big part of what she does, because some of the work that has really, you know, that have been the #1 hits and that she's known for do very much have that dark Nirvana-esque, Nine Inch Nails-esque energy. but she has songs that are just her playing a ukulele and her brother playing a very childlike melody on a glockenspiel. Um, and and if you were to just hear that and you did not have the prior exposure to the other stuff, I think you would almost think it was cliche Wes Anderson quirky. Even in the dark side of it, if you just look at that, I agree with you. Even in that, it's kind of a metamodern dark, but there's an additional component, which is it goes all the way over to the childlike, quirky, playful at times as well. And then she makes them oscillate and work together in a bigger whole that I think is almost like more metamodern than anything we've seen. Yeah,
Okay.
because it has so many levels.
I will check this out.
Okay.
And then another example of so since we're talking about the quirky, of this characteristic or this quality that seems so metamodern to the maybe earlier period of metamodernism, if we're willing to establish something like that, where we might see, for example, the Michel Gondry oeuvre, where he's using this really, really flowery, colorful, jubilant, playful, overtly drawn clouds and characters are able to float and move and be in a very fantastical space. Mr. Corman actually uses
I still haven't seen it, yeah.
same
No.
aesthetic in a much different way. It's a much darker kind of register where he's still flying off into a fantasy, and that's not the only show. It's this one I'm thinking of now, and the fantasy includes a lot of these sort of this like collage of strangely almost two-dimensional pieces that are stylized to where there's no question that you're supposed to know or that they're playing in an unreal environment, but extremely dark psychologically speaking in some senses. So do we have a kind of something we might call dark metamodernism happening these days?
Well, I mean, I would, yes, maybe, but in a way, I would say that although I would agree that most of the artworks or performances that also Robin and I mentioned in the first article, that many of them were optimistic, there was always this trend, right? Dennis Rudolph is one of the artists we mentioned, and his work was always an incredibly dark, almost fascist nationalism. I think a number of those romanticist artists or sort of neo-romanticists had this real darkness in it. It was never this sort of picture of the world will be better. It was more, we have to find a new future, regardless, right? Against better knowledge. It's this constant, this dark, I like the term dark metamodernism, but I do also think it's not something new necessarily. I do think that probably it's become more prevalent, a hardened, more cynical view of some of those processes that we've all been recognizing for a long time, which might in turn be a fatigue, as Greg might say, with what came before, might also be a realization that a number of the projects that I was very hopeful would change things haven't really changed things at all. Right, so it might again be a variation of reasons for that. Yeah, maybe.
But still,
maybe there is a dark. Maybe the pandemic has helped. I mean, definitely, of course, some of the findings in Me Too and the terrible racism and all the there is a more open discussion. I think helps creating also a metamodernism which is darker in that way. But I think the key, regardless of the attitude or of the point of view of the show or of the song, is this sense of a futurity, right? Jameson says postmodernism with all these senses of an ending. And I think that regardless of whichever we're talking about, they're all geared towards the possibility that things might be other than they are, that there is something perhaps outside of the mall, even if we can't see it, that we have to reorganize ourselves within. And that seems to me that real key of the sensibility, regardless of whether it's quirky in the Miranda July or quirky in the Billie Eilish, regardless of whether it's something like Parks and Rec or I May Destroy You or White Lotus Hotel. They seem to all carry this within them, where it's not just a taking apart of what's there, but it's the construction of something other. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'm thinking about whether the this notion of a future with full acknowledgement of our situatedness is, and you were mentioning that may be part of the heart of what metamodernism is. And I wonder if that would replace the idea that oscillation is the heart of metamodernism, which you never yourself necessarily said, but many people grabbed onto that aspect of your and Robin's article and really dug in hard on oscillation. But you referred to other ideas like depthiness, and this is another one that I'm just rolling around in my head now since you've said it. Because Greg will talk about the heart of metamodernism being felt experience, and I've sometimes said if I were to vote, if I had to pick one thing to be at the heart, I would say hyper self-reflexivity. So yeah, maybe we can share our current thoughts on this. What's at the
But this
heart?
oscillation thing is, I mean, as we wrote in the first article, also the second, it was more also like metamodernism itself, oscillation was more of a placeholder, right? I think we all struggle with this, that we noticed that there were these weird phenomena that would do opposite things all at once without it necessarily being a problem. And so I think we write that also, right? We don't know if it's the right term, right? It might be Sloterdijk's bubbles, it might be multi-stability, it might be the Wittgenstein's dog rabbit, right? But we have to figure out a model that tries to capture the coexistence of those completely incompatible. And we found that that notion of Schlegel with the romantic very useful, and of course we found that notion of Plato with the metoxis incredibly useful. And I think I still stand by that. I still think that also the stuff that I talked about now is marked by various oscillations, because I don't think that either of those shows or of those artworks or musicians ever becomes fully this or fully that, right? There seems to be a constant movement between how fast or slow that movement is or which directions it goes. I have no idea. But I do think we should see these as movements that are constantly sort of bound by one another, right? I don't think that Billie Eilish is not about depression or fanaticism or blind optimism, right? It would be nonsense to say any of those things. It is clearly, you know, as Greg also said, a constant movement between, as a result of which it is both, or it's all of those and none of those, right? Which is that Platonic problem. It's Erik Voegelin, who I disagree with on everything else he wrote, but what he, I think, captures really well with that metoxis that he builds on Plato is, you know, what do you do if you have a character that is both mortal and immortal? It's impossible, right? It's an ontological impossibility. You cannot be both at once, and yet here they are. Here's Eros, here's Hercules. All these characters are both mortal and immortal. And so what do you do? Well, he says, Plato devises the metoxis, which is to say it is both of them and neither. And I think this is this key, right? This both neither. And this is why oscillation seemed to us a useful term. But as you also mentioned, if someone finds a better one, I'd be perfectly happy. The better one might be Raoul's notion of the double framing. I don't think so, but it is a very useful model for some phenomena that I see around me. So it's just a placeholder, I guess, for describing something that we all recognize and that needs a vocabulary, but might not have one.
Agreed.
Yeah. I think we now are at the end of your time limit.
Yes, yeah. Well, hopefully not the timeline, but yes, we are. Yeah.
If you have a few more minutes,
that would have been so terrible.
If you have a few more minutes, we would like to just wrap up by asking you about your works in progress, which I understand you have more than one going.
Well, I mean, yes. So I'm now. I mean, I'm with research leave at the moment. So I'm now wrapping up with Kim Wilkins, my colleague who has written on eccentric cinema, which is similar to quirky, and I think a brilliant concept also to describe, amongst others, Wes Anderson, Spike Jonze, Miranda July.
Great.
Some of those right in her book came out a few years back with Bloomsbury. And she and I are now doing a book on Linklater, which is Linklater, an edited collection, which I do also think is again one of those directors that doesn't seem to fit in anywhere, right? It's a very interesting figure. It's an edited collection on Linklater that's wrapping up. That's almost done. Then I'm working on a book which is due to be delivered with SUNY very soon on gestures in American visual media. So, for example, I'm looking at Donald Glover's gestures and gestures in time, gestures in This Is America, as a way in which those gestures, the way in which he uses his hands and the way in which he uses his face, enable, afford, and delimit particular temporalities. And I'm looking, for example, in the way in which Trevor Noah and John Oliver, as a black man and a white man, can filter anger, right? The way in which they can use gestures to express or not express anger, which I think is a very contemporary emotion, or the way in which Betty in Father Knows Best is able to move as a girl through that through the 1950s household, or the way in which Rory Gilmore in the Gilmore Girls behaves like a teenager. So I'm trying to understand how various gestures connote or communicate to us very distinct notions of time, right? It might be aging, it might be unage, it might be history or historical moment, and so on and so forth. So this is a book that I'm working on. Then, as said, Kim and I are working on a special issue on Pastiche after postmodernism. I'm working on another project with Louis Bayman on temporalities, and that hopefully also will become a special issue. Then there is the Metamodernism book, long awaited, never written, but we are hopefully at one point doing it because we have loads of actually pieces lying around. So this is really something that we should finish. And the Depthiness book is I'm working on next year. So loads of it. I doubt any of it will happen, but let's see if some of it will happen. No,
So
I mean, it should all happen.
Is the Metamodernism book you're referring to a update of the 2017 edited volume?
No, this will be a monograph. This would this is a monograph. Yeah. So this would be this is something we were working on. Then well, I mean, quite frankly, life interfered. We had kids, we moved places, we had, as I'm sure you're also experiencing, we had to do administrative stuff at work and all kinds of stuff. So we couldn't work on it, and we're working on individual projects. Yeah. And it is something, there is lots lying around. So I think it hopefully shouldn't take too much time, but I've been saying that for 5 years. So I mean, I'm excited. But yes, no, this will be a monograph that Ellie and Robin and I would write. Yeah.
Okay.
That's exciting.
That is really exciting. That's...
Let's see, right?
No, you have to do it.
By the time we've published it, every single other person has already written a monograph on Metamodern. So let's see if we eventually do that.
Well, stuff. Present company included, each of us is working on a
amazing. That sounds amazing. I'm so happy to hear this. So are you turning your PhD into a monograph?
I'm hoping to do so. Yes. Working on book proposal now. That's right.
That's fantastic.
Thanks. Yeah.
And I'm working. So excited. Yeah. And I'm working on a book for educated lay people about metamodernism.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, this is so exciting. I'm so excited to hear this. Well, those books will definitely be out before ours. So that's really good.
Let's see. Let's not take any bets on it, but
we can have a competition for how slow we are.
Right. This is yeah. No, I think it's, as I'm sure you all know, working together is one of the greatest joys. But if there's no firm deadline that you put yourself, it's also the thing that always is moved up. Yeah, it's always the stuff that's sort of pushed because you're working on all these other things that have firm deadlines. So this is, I think, why we just kept moving it. Yeah, but it has to happen.
Tim, we know that you do have to go on to your other commitments today, and we have many more topics we'd love to discuss with you another time, perhaps. Maybe we can.
Yes, let's do that.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking me to do this, you two, and thanks for doing this wonderful series that you are putting up here. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, thanks, and thank you for gracing our series with your presence, your insight.
Viewership will really drop after this. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. Hey, have a good one, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.